Alright, next up, let's have a look at fluid simulations in Blender 2.90.1. So I'm gonna click away the splash screen. And in fluid simulations, you need a couple of types of objects. So first, we're gonna need a domain in which all the simulation happens. So we might as well just use this cube that's right here already. Let's scale it up by pressing S once. Scale it up like that. Move it up on the Z-axis by pressing G and Z. And let's look inside by pressing Z once and choosing wireframe. And this is going to be our domain object. So inside of this, just going to add a cube. This is going to be our flow object. So that's where the fluid is actually coming from. So let's see some of those settings. Here in physics properties, you got this section fluid. So I'm going to click that and you can choose the type. So the type of our fluid object here is going to be flow. And the flow type will be liquid. And the flow behavior determines what type of flow object this is, basically. So geometry means that you only use this geometry as the fluid amount. If you change it to inflow, that's going to constantly output fluid into the domain. So basically the domain is the boundaries for the fluid simulation. Otherwise it would take ages if it would be huge. So it's always good to keep the domain to a minimum size, as small as possible. Okay, other flow behavior is outflow, which is sort of a drain. So if you would have that on the floor, for example, then the fluid would escape from there. So leave the domain and the scene. However, let's first try the geometry flow behavior. And let's click on the domain, set it up as fluid, and type domain. This is where most of the settings tweaking happens. So first, the domain type is liquid. Resolution divisions defines how what's the resolution of your liquid simulation. So bigger is better, but bigger is also slower. You have to keep that in mind. So 32 is the beginning value here. Then time steps, we're gonna come into that later. Other values, well, mesh is gonna be important later. And then there's the frame start and end. So if you ever have problems where the fluid simulations is abruptly ending, middle of your animation, check this value. So doesn't end somewhere like frame 50. All right, let's play our animation and let's reset it to the beginning. Now the fluid object should splash around. Nothing's happening. So I'm going to change the end of timeline to 100. So let it go until the end and still nothing happens. One way you could refresh this animation is changing the type here. So type is replay now, change it to all and change it back to replay. That should change something inside this fluid simulator, and you should see some particles that are acting like a fluid. And now you can click on the mesh tick box, which makes the fluid into a mesh object. So you actually see how the fluid is behaving. So the resolution is pretty low now, 32. And you can see the bits and drips are pretty large. So that's because of the resolution. And one thing to note now is that the selected object, the fluid itself, is actually the domain object. So the surrounding cube, the boundaries, became the fluid. It might be hard to understand, but you'll grasp it eventually. and they're being emitted from the flow object, which is the cube. So the amount that's the size of the flow object is being dropped on the domain floor. Every time you need to change the size of the domain object, you can just untick the mesh box and change it. All right, what about the other flow types? Excuse me, I mean flow behavior. So let's change it to inflow. That would constantly output liquid. So going back to the domain and just refreshing it by changing the type from replay to all and back to replay. Okay, so there's a constant output of fluid now. So if we see the mesh version, the fluid is being output and it slowly starts filling up the domain. For some reason it cuts here. Changing the CFL number gets the job done, so the inflow for the liquid lasts longer now. All right, what about colliding objects with the fluid? So let's see, let's add a cylinder and give it a fluid physics property and change the type to effector. So the effector type is collision. Over here, surface thickness magic number seems to be 0.7. So let's use that. And then let's choose the domain again, the liquid, and reset it, changing the type to all, back to replay. And then going back to the beginning of the timeline and replaying it, we can see the cylinder is being consumed, overwhelmed by the liquid, and it's colliding with the liquid correctly. What if we wanted to make a cup out of this cylinder? So we could scale it down on the z-axis, S and Z, like so. Maybe scale it up a bit. And I just want to see my domain boundaries now. So I'm going to click on the liquid or domain and untick the mesh box. Choose this cylinder again. Scale it down on the z-axis to make the bottom. And go into edit mode, changing from object mode to edit mode. Click on face select and select all the faces that are circling around the cylinder. So you can hit hold down Alt on your keyboard and click on this vertical edge to quickly select the loop. All right, then you can hit E to extrude and right click to snap where it started. Hit S to scale. Scale it somewhere there. Then I want to choose the upper loop for this. So I'm going to hold down Alt and select these faces. So the up facing faces for the cylinder's edge. And I just want to extrude those now. So hit E to extrude and we got a glass. So let's say we want to have our fluid falling into the glass, and then let's turn the glass around. So let's try that. I'm going to move the glass here first and change the flow behavior into geometry. And then we're going to animate this. So right about here, maybe frame 30. I'm going to give it a keyframe rotation. And at frame 40, it should have rotated 180 degrees on the x-axis. So I'm going to select the cup, hit R once, X once, and type in 180 and hit enter. And press I to add a keyframe rotation. So the cup is turning around. Let's try and reset the liquid simulation. So choosing the domain, click on type, put it to all, put it back to replay, and play the animation. Nothing happens. All right, now we see something, and the liquid seems to follow the glass. Let's try and make it mesh. All right, so the liquid is moving really quickly. And there are some splashes that might, it seems like they're coming through the object. So if you want to try and fix that, you might want to choose the domain. And here you got time steps maximum. So you could try and up that, set the maximum to 10 and the minimum to 8. And then you just need to recalculate the animation. It's going to take a while now because this increases the steps that are considered in the simulation. So obviously it's going to take a while longer. So our fluid is landing nicely on the bottom of the cup, and the cup is turning, and there seems to be no problem holding the fluid inside the cup anymore while it's turning around, and the fluid is reaching the bottom of the domain inside the glass. Right now we have a domain that's bottom is close to the hole in the cup, so it doesn't actually let the fluid come through because the bottom of the domain closes that gap. But if you wanted to have the fluid splash out, you could change the size of the domain to be a bit bigger, and then just rewind, and of course you have to refresh the animation and then replay it and set it up as mesh. So now the fluid should splash around after it's flown out of the glass. Now we see it turning, and the fluid is coming out, and there's a bigger gap now between the glass and the domain, so you can see the fluid can spread around after it's flowed out of the glass. And there you go. What if you wanted to combine a rigid body animation with the fluid simulation? So let's try that next. I'm just gonna start a new file, and inside this cube let's have a fluid simulation, and let's have a few obstacles that the cube is gonna fall on. So I'm gonna duplicate the cube, Shift D and press Z, make sort of a stair or a step underneath it. Gonna move it on the y-axis so it's gonna tumble, and scale this cube on the z-axis a bit and move it up. And let's make a domain out of this, duplicate this one, scale it up, and press Z and go into wireframe mode to see what's going on. And maybe scale down the domain, it doesn't have to be that big. And actually, let's make a floor, Shift A, mesh, plane, move it on the Z axis and scale it up. So make the floor a rigid body, go into physics, rigid body, and type passive. Make this one rigid body, type active. Make this one rigid body, type passive. And play the animation, you should see a tumbling cube. Alright, let's make this animation shorter. So set the end time to be 100. And actually we only need 70 frames, I think. Alright. Go back to the beginning and choose this cube again. Duplicate it, Shift D, and scale down the cube inside it. Scale it even more down. And place it here close to the bottom of the cube. So this is going to be our fluid object, and this is going to be our effector, collision object, and this is going to be our domain. So choosing this, let's first make this fluid, type domain, domain type liquid, and we might actually already put the time steps to be, let's make 8 and 6, see if that works. And frame end, we're only going to need 70 frames for the animation, so that's all good. And right away, why not make it a mesh? Choose this object and make it fluid. So it's got two physics properties now, rigid body and fluid. Make the fluid type into effector and keep it collision and make the surface thickness 0.7. Then choose the last object, which is going to be the fluid. Give it a fluid property, type, flow, flow type liquid, and flow behavior is geometry. All right, we should be good to go. One more thing, because we duplicated this from the outer cube, it's got the rigid body physics type, but we're just going to remove that. So it doesn't need this, otherwise it's just going to blow up. All right, and it's running pretty slow, but there's no liquid as of yet. Let's try and choose the domain and reset. Choose type, all, type, replay. And let's wait for it to begin again. Still nothing. Untick the mesh box. Type, all, type, replay. One problem might be that the normals of the cube are facing outwards, which means the fluid simulator understands this as a solid object, whereas it should be a box that's having the liquid inside. So let's see what we can do. Choosing this cube and going to edit mode. Click here where there's two intersecting circles. Click on the arrow next to it. You should see normals way here in the bottom. So click on the third icon from the left and increase the size. And you can see the normals are facing outwards. That means the direction of the faces, that's what normals are. So what we could do is go to edge. Mesh, normals, and choose flip. So that's going to turn them inwards. Now if we play the fluid animation, let's see what happens. choose the domain and reset it. And there we have our fluid particles now showing. If we change it to mesh, it should work just fine. So the fluid is staying mostly inside the box. Of course, we should increase the time steps maximum here. Let's make it 12 and minimum 10. One thing to note is that if you have very rough falls happening, like if the distance that the cube is falling from is high, then it's going to be more difficult to keep the fluid inside the box.